everyone. I hope you and your families are doing well. I want to welcome you all to our July 28th Town Hall, which will be focused on the disclosure question revisions. My name is Lisa Tinsley. I'm a director with the NMLS Business Services team at CSBS, and today I'll be acting as your host. Next slide, please. The purpose of today's meeting is to provide an in-depth review of the proposed revisions to the disclosure questions and to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Before we dive in, I want to share some housekeeping guidelines. We will move on to welcoming and opening remarks. Then we'll have an overview of the proposal and finish with question and answers. Before we move on, I would like to take just a moment to remind those participating today that CSBS administers the NMLS on behalf of the states. It is a collaborative system. On major items such as these revisions to the disclosure questions, we go out for public comment because your feedback is important. Moving on to the housekeeping slide. First and foremost, I want to make you all aware that this meeting is being recorded. The recording and slide deck will be distributed after the meeting. During presentations, all participants will be muted. Questions will be taken via the WebEx chat feature. If questions are not covered during the presentation, they will be queued for the Q&A section at the end of the meeting. Also, when submitting a question, please make sure to send it to all panelists. This presentation will also use live polls, so we hope that you're prepared to participate and offer your feedback. Next slide, please. So let's get warmed up with a polling question. To participate in the polls, you can either scan the QR code on the screen with your phone, follow the link provided in the chat, or go to menti.com and enter the code 65985575. So let's give everyone a moment to get signed on. Okay, we can move on. If you still need to sign on, the chat information, the sign up information is in the chat. And so we figured everyone was used to the "what state are you from" question, so we decided to shake things up and ask, how many states is your company licensed in? We're going to take a little extra time here for responses since we have a large crowd today. Wow, it looks like the majority of you are licensed in 35 plus states. 54. Perfect. Okay, thank you all. Let's move on to the next slide. These revisions have taken a lot of time and effort, not just from CSBS staff, but from our committees and working groups, both regulator and industry. Two committee members are joining us today, and I want to take a moment to introduce them. First, we have Jim Payne. Jim, if you could join me on stage for just a moment. Jim is the Assistant Deputy Commissioner, Director of Examinations for the Consumer and Mortgage Lending Division with the Kansas Office of the State Bank Commissioner. Jim serves on the NMLS Policy Committee and is the current NMLS Ombudsman. Next, we have Cindy Fazio. Cindy, if you could join us. Cindy is the Director of the Division of Consumer Services with the Washington Department of Financial Institutions. Cindy is the immediate past chair of the SRR Lawyers Committee. And finally, I'm joined by Janine Bjorn. Janine, if you could join us on stage as well. Janine is from CSBS and serves as Senior Director with the NMLS Business Services team. Jim will be covering why we are revising the questions. Cindy will be covering the key revisions being made, and Janine will be walking us through the specific changes made, and she will explain next steps. Moving on to the next slide. Jim is going to begin the presentation with a conversation on why we are revising the questions. Next slide, please. Jim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Why are we revising the disclosure questions? This slide shows some of the key reasons that they're being revised. And basically, they have not been holistically revised in quite some time, 15 plus years. Approximately 15 or 80% of agencies polled when asked, they said they need to be reviewed and updated holistically. Several of the questions in the glossary terms have been clarified to aid in industry determination of what should be disclosed, and new terms have also been added. And so, while related, it's not dependent. This initiative is not dependent on modernization efforts with the system. So, once the review process is complete and decisions have been made as to the revisions, we can go ahead and move forward and incorporate them into the current application process. And we are cognizant of timing, and we will make sure that it is the least intrusive when the disclosure questions are reviewed and require new answers and filings. So we will keep it outside of the fourth quarter, for example. As noted in the background section of the request for public comment document, earlier this year, on behalf of the NMLS Policy Committee, SRR invited regulator comments and feedback on the proposed revisions to the disclosure questions. And upon the close of the regulator comment period, CSBS staff reviewed the regulator comments and received and vetted each comment with the SRR Lawyers Committee before presenting it to the NMLS Policy Committee with a recommendation of disposition for each comment received. So the proposal presented incorporates all the regulator feedback and that which with the policy committee has approved. So Lisa, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Jim. The SRR Lawyers Committee spent a significant amount of time over the last year reviewing and providing input. So we thought it fitting that Cindy Fazio from the Lawyers Committee walk us through some of these key revisions. Cindy, please join me on stage.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and thanks, Jim, and thanks very much, Janine. Everybody, I'm really sorry about the delay. That was my technical issue. I do have a new laptop, and I've worked through all the kinks with every application, but for WebEx. So really sorry about that. So big picture, and I'm just going to do a sound check. You all can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you, Cindy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Big picture, as we said, the disclosure questions have not been reviewed overall for many, many years, and it was definitely needed. So big picture, we restructured things so that the company questions are together, the individual questions are together, and the individual questions are bifurcated by individuals who have control and individuals who don't have control. Next slide, please. So, and then within each grouping of questions, there was some inconsistencies. So as we started through the company questions, we would lead with one particular topic. As we started through the individual questions, we would lead with another topic. So within the groupings of questions, we tried to harmonize that. So the company disclosure did begin with the criminal disclosure questions. The individual questions began with financial disclosure questions. So the categories are now the same for both. We sorted all that out. We did make some definitional changes, and so that's always important to take a look at, and that's based on the fact that we got a lot of questions about the definitions. We did add, backing up just a minute, we did add a couple of categories of regulatory bodies. So for instance, some regulatory authority rests only within an agency, some lies within a state's attorney general category with their own consumer protection. So we tried to add in those additional regulatory bodies where we could. The misdemeanor term has been revised from ever to 10 years, and that's for the individual, and that now mirrors the company misdemeanor level. So we also clarified company and individuals who are acting under the authority as contractors, accountants, or attorneys. We pulled that out into their own sections. If there's in the company section, if a section is not applicable, you move on to the next section. And same with the individual, and if they exercise control or not, they can bypass one section and move on to the other. So just a really good, we hope that you agree that we did a really good technical review to make everything, the sections mirror each other, to make them make sense internally, and to clarify some issues that have been sticking points, and those were definitions. The really important thing is, I know it's summer, and this is probably incredibly dry reading for you to look at, but very important that you get your comments in by August 22nd. So we've been living with this document, if you will, this body of work for quite a while in going through the revisions, first the regulators, then the regulator comments, then the back to the lawyers committee. Then so we've been living with this document for a while. So having fresh user eyes on it will be very valuable. So do please take the time and trouble to go through the sections and provide your comments. And again, that's due by August 22nd. And again, sorry about the delay, and I think we are back to Janine. So, and just thanks to all the support we've had at CSBS in working through these. It's you know, incredibly technical, and a lot of people have been asking a lot of questions on the regulator side. So enormous thanks go out to Janine for having the patience while we work through this document. So thanks everybody, and I'll be hanging back here in the background. Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Cindy. So all of those with firsthand knowledge of this project know that Janine was the spearhead. As Cindy just mentioned, she's done a wonderful job of tracking all the issues, writing and revising the questions based on feedback that we've received. So it seems fitting to turn it over to her to walk us through in detail the changes of each section. But I think, Janine, you're going to start us with a poll.
Correct. But I'd like to thank Cindy, Jim, and Lisa for their kind comments. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining today. And as we said, we really want your feedback. It is important. So please get your comments in by August 22nd. So as you can see on the next slide, we do have a poll. Have you or your company reviewed the disclosure questions proposal? So if you're in Venti.com, you can see the code at the top, 65985575. So we'll give folks a few minutes to populate. So for those of you that answered no, this is the perfect place to be this afternoon, because we're going to do a deep dive into the questions. We're going to go question by question. So hopefully at the end of today's session, you'll have a really good feel for what the changes are in the disclosure questions, for which we're seeking your comment by August 22nd. So let's dive in. Today's slides are going to show if we can go to the next slide. Today's slides are going to show the questions as revised, and I will walk through the changes. As we go along, place your questions in the chat. And as you can see, we're going to start with the company disclosure questions. So turning to the next slide is the first question. So in this question, rather than each item in this list A through E start with in the past 10 years, you can see that we moved in the past 10 years to the beginning of the question. We also changed this to read in the past 10 years, has any court, as opposed to has any domestic, foreign, or military court found, etc. This change is made throughout the document, and I will refer to this change as the any court change. As indicated in the glossary document included with the proposal, court is now a defined term. The term court includes but is not limited to a domestic, foreign, military, or tribal court. Secondly, the definition of found in the glossary does not fit well with the use of found in the questions. So we've revised or proposed an amended definition for found, which you can find in the proposal as well. The revised definition makes it clear that if something is a matter of public record, it must be disclosed. Question 1A is new and mirrors the same question that we have today for individuals. Question 1C is new and was added to mirror the question 14C currently in the company questions, because in some states, agencies enforce a civil action in court as opposed to an administrative action. We added any consumer protection authority in item 1E. Cindy had mentioned this when she talked about some of the high level changes. Consumer protection is a new glossary term. Briefly, the new term is defined as laws or regs designed to protect the consumer. And then we have it including but not limited to list in the definition, such as laws or regulations which limit or prohibit unfair, deceptive, or fraudulent practices or require disclosures to consumers. As noted in the section in the proposal that summarizes the revisions applicable to both company and individual questions, the term financial services or financial services related, which appears throughout the questions today, was amended to provide clarity. We redefined so that the term financial services includes those activities that are financial services or financial services related. We also expanded the term financial services to include consumer protection laws or regulations, as we mentioned previously. So everywhere the term financial services related appears in the questions today was changed to read financial services, and you can see a revised definition of the term financial services in the redlined glossary revisions in the proposal. So moving on. So actually, before we move on, please note, while this question is still on the screen, that items A through C refer to findings, while D and E are actions, and you'll see what I mean, why I pointed that out shortly. So if you could turn to the next slide, please. So questions 2 and 3 are currently questions G in the company disclosure questions. Question G refers to question F, which is now the first question that we went over. As I pointed when we had the question 1 up, the current question G asks about pending civil actions for those items that are in question 1. As I just mentioned, the items listed in question 1 are findings and actions. So we broke the current question G into 2. Question 2 has the findings that we are inquiring about in question 1. And question 3 has the actions that are in question 1. So let's turn to the criminal disclosure questions on the next slide. So question 4, we made the change to any court as I described originally. And in question 5, rather than ask if the entity or control affiliate has ever been charged with any felony, the question is amended to ask whether there's a felony charge pending against the entity or control affiliate. This language mirrors the language for the corresponding question for an individual. The current question, meaning what we have today, is broader and states, has the entity or control affiliate ever been charged with any felony? So turning to the next slide, the items in question 6 have not changed, but the items are in a list rather than in one sentence. Believe that that's much easier to read and respond to. And then we obviously have made the change again to any court, as noted in number 6. And then in question 7, we added the word any before pending charges, and we added the word any before misdemeanor, as opposed to reading a misdemeanor. Before I move on to the financial disclosure questions, I also want to call to your attention to the proposed revision to the revision 1 to the guidebook, which is also in the proposal. It provides further guidance stating that disclosure of a sealed or expunged conviction or item is not required if relevant state law or court order does not require disclosure. The second item noted under the guidebook revisions is that disclosure of a felony or misdemeanor case disposed of in juvenile court is not required if relevant state law or court order does not require disclosure. So let's turn to financial disclosure on the next page. So in question 8, we expanded the question to include whether a bankruptcy has been filed by adding filed or before been the subject of a bankruptcy petition. And we also added at the end of question 8, whether voluntary or involuntary, to modify the bankruptcy petition. In question 9, we reworded this question to add issuance of after the word denied, so the respondent must also disclose if they have ever been denied issuance of a bond. Question 10 and 11 is an example of where we split a current question into two. The current question is, does the entity have any unsatisfied judgments or liens against it? And as you can see, we've split this into two questions, 10 and 11. We also propose two new glossary terms, lien and unsatisfied. The proposed definition of a lien that is found in the glossary carves out a mortgage lien, so it's clear that you need not disclose mortgage liens. And it also provides a list of some items that are included in the definition. As you'll see, the proposed definition is the term lien includes, but is not limited to, judgment liens, tax liens, child support liens, IRS liens, liens related to a collection account, and mechanics or materialmen's liens. The term does not include a mortgage lien. There was also a proposed definition for unsatisfied. This would be a newly defined term. And the definition makes it clear that something is deemed unsatisfied if payments are being made on it. So the definition of unsatisfied that you'll find in the glossary portion of the proposal states a unsatisfied is any item that is not paid in full, including but not limited to any items for which payments are being made pursuant to a payment plan or otherwise. Turning to question 12, this is a new question that goes to the very core of an applicant's ability to conduct its business. A third-party service provider is also a newly defined term. Before that, I will read the question. I know you can read it on your screen, but the new question is, has a third-party service provider notified the entity or a control affiliate of its intent to modify or cancel an arrangement with the entity or a control affiliate that would materially alter the entity's ability to conduct its business activities for the license it holds or intends to hold? So in connection with this new question that really does go to the heart of an applicant's ability to conduct its business, we have added third-party servicer as a newly defined term in the glossary. And basically, it would include an individual or a company, including a company's subsidiaries, affiliates, that provide goods or services to an entity in connection with the operations of its business. And you'll also find some guidance on what goods and services are. Question 13 on the screen is new, and this was added to incorporate a requirement of the model law. The new question being in the past 10 years, has the entity or a control affiliate been involved in any material litigation? Well, this question was added as a result of the model law, which pertains to money transmission. The question is germane to all industries, and therefore it was added. There is a material litigation definition that is proposed as a new glossary term. The material litigation that is found in the glossary is that which is in the model law, and it reads, material litigation is defined as litigation that, according to generally accepted accounting principles, is significant to an applicant's or a licensee's financial health and would be required to be disclosed in the applicant's or licensee's annual audited financial statements, report to shareholders, or similar records. So let's turn to the regulatory action disclosure questions that are on the next slide. So as you will see, the regulatory action disclosure questions have been divided into two parts. Part one will be applicable to all applicants, and part two may or may not be applicable to all applicants. So as I mentioned earlier, depending upon the states, regulatory actions may be brought via a civil or an administrative action. Therefore, where appropriate in the regulatory action section, the language was changed to account for this fact. So in question 14, as Cindy mentioned earlier, we added a local regulatory agency, a governmental entity, and any consumer protection authority to the question. We also added definitions, two new definitions, consumer protection, which I already mentioned, and we also added a definition for a governmental entity, which would be a department or agency of the United States, any state or political subdivision thereof, or of a locality that regulates financial services activity. The term also includes a department or agency or the equivalent of a foreign sovereignty. Item C on your screen was reworded to read license or authorization to conduct business, and we also added the word another before financial services business to make it clear that the reference is to another licensee. Question 14D is new, and item E is an example of an item that was reworded to account for how regulatory actions may be brought as noted above, i.e. either administratively or civilly. We also added dismissal of an action pursuant to a settlement agreement. So it looks like we do have a question for question 12. Does this mean that if a vendor files for bankruptcy but is just one of 10 vendors that we use would cause a response to this question? Example, Sprout Mortgage is one of 10 vendors and they file for bankruptcy. So question 12 is the one to refresh, was that if a third-party service provider notified the entity or of a control affiliate of its intent to modify or cancel arrangement that would materially alter the entity's ability to conduct its business activities. So in response to the question, if you have one of 10 vendors that basically file bankruptcy, informs you that they'll no longer operate or no longer provide services to you, if that material affects your ability if you don't have another vendor to provide those services to you and they were key for your business model, then I think it would material alter. If you've got another vendor that can provide the same thing, then I think you could, assuming it doesn't materially alter your ability to conduct business, you would not have to answer affirmatively. We obviously can't give you legal advice, but I think the key in the question is if it would materially alter your ability to operate. So I hope that answers the question for the person that posed the question. So, and if it doesn't, please feel free to type again in the chat. So on I think we just finished question 14. So moving to the next slide with question 15. So today's question E for the company questions asks about a pending regulatory action proceeding for any alleged violation in question 14. And like you'll hear me say today a few times, that question 14 has findings and actions. So items A through C noted above are those findings. So those are the only items from question 14 that need to be addressed here. So we've really provided some clarity on this particular question. So let's go on to part 2 of the regulatory action disclosures, which are on the next slide. So as I said, part 2 may or may not be applicable to all applicants. We have put into part 2 those questions that pertain to an entity or control affiliate and their ability to act as an accountant, an attorney, or a contractor on behalf of a federal, state, or local government entity. We have broken out the questions, one set for contractors, one for attorneys, one for accountants, and one for financial services professional licensees, which is a new question. So all or some of these questions could be not applicable, and there will be a not applicable answer choice. So with regard to the contractor questions, we expanded the type of contractor to include local contractors, and we changed the contractor language to replace act as a federal, state, or local contractor, which is the current verbiage, to read act as a contractor on behalf of a federal, state, or local government entity. We've also just reworded the language ever so slightly, but to provide a little more clarity in these two questions. We've added or we've amended the term authorization to act today to read ability to or authorization to act in question 16. We've also added debarred and restricted to the list of actions referred to in question 16 and inquired about. And obviously, corresponding terms in question 17 would be debarment and restriction. We also reworded question 17 and others like it to require disclosure where the remedy being sought is or could be any of the enumerated items. So the next two slides have questions 18 to 23, but let's just go to the next slide first. So questions 18 to 23 pertain to entities who have key individuals or control individuals who are or have ever been licensed as attorneys or accountants, or who hold or have ever held a financial services professional license. These questions make it clear that they pertain to key individuals or control individuals as identified in the company's NMLS record. The language in the attorney and accountant questions have been changed. Entities may be law firms, like a partnership, or CPA firms, but it's the individuals within those firms that would have had their license to practice law or their CPA license revoked. So therefore, the inquiry has been changed to apply to key individuals or control individuals identified in a company record. Key individual is also a newly defined term that you'll find in the glossary, and the definition tracks the language pertaining to the key individual wizard. So question 18 and 19 pertain to the attorneys, followed by questions 20 and 21 for accountants. So before we move to the next slide with questions 20 to 23, on this group of questions, we've added restricted to the actions that could be taken against any of these licenses. So you will see the word restricted added in question 18. It's also added in questions 20 and 22, which we will get to shortly. And then we've added restricted to the list of actions inquired about in questions 19 and questions 21 and 23. So moving to the next slide, you will see the accountant questions. And then beneath those, you will see the questions pertaining to a financial services license or any other professional license. So these questions have the same construct as the prior questions. Questions 22 and 23 are new, and they pertain to an individual's financial services license or any professional license. So before we move to the individual questions, I believe we have a poll on the next slide. Great. So do you agree with the revisions to the company disclosure questions that I just reviewed? And please, I see one company that says no. Please submit your comments. Explain why, what you disagree with. We will certainly we will be reading and take into consideration any and all comments that we receive. For those of you that don't know, that's fine too. If after you review the proposal, you have questions, feel free to reach out. So let's move on to the individual questions. Okay, so on the next slide, you'll see the first three individual questions. Question one, as you can see, we made the any court change that I referred to with the first question for the company. Question 1A is new and mirrors the company question. We added Consumer Protection Authority to 1D, and as I said during the company questions, we have provided a proposed definition of consumer protection. So question 2 and 3 is once again illustrative of a current question of question J that asks about findings and actions. So question 2 inquires about the findings that appear in question 1, and question 3 asks about the actions that are asked for in question 1. So moving on to the criminal disclosure questions. Lisa, please interrupt me if we have any comments or questions in the chat.
We're good. We're working through them right now.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the criminal disclosure questions, as you can see in question 4 and actually question 6, we made the change to any court as we described before. In question 5, we added the word any before pending charges. In question 6, rather than disclosing any misdemeanors as you must do today, the proposed revision would limit disclosure of misdemeanor items to the last 10 years. This mirrors the time limit for the company misdemeanor question. Also, as we did in the company questions, the items in this question have been listed and numbered rather than put in one sentence. And then finally, in question 7, we added the word any before the words pending and added the word any before the word misdemeanor. So moving on the next slide to customer arbitration and civil litigation disclosure questions, or I'm sorry, the customer arbitration question. We changed the language, a very minor tweak. We changed the language to read respondent or defendant rather than respondent/defendant. Moving on to the financial disclosure questions on the next slide. In question 9, once again, we added file or to the question, just like we did in the company questions, and we added whether voluntary or involuntary to describe the bankruptcy petition at the end of the question. For question 10, the current question asks, have you been the subject of a foreclosure action within the past 10 years? The term foreclosure action does not account for those states where foreclosures are conducted non-judicially. So we've reworded the question to require respondents to disclose any foreclosure efforts they have been subject to, either judicial or non-judicial. We've also added either commercial or residential to the end of the question to clarify that either type must be disclosed. Also, efforts to foreclose is a newly defined glossary term. You'll find it in the glossary, and it says efforts to foreclose include but are not limited to a completed foreclosure, entering into a deed in lieu of foreclosure, a sale under a power of sale, notice of public auction, notice of default, notice of trustee's sale, notice of list pendants, and release of list pendants. And all these definitions, as I said, are in the proposal, in the glossary section of the proposal. As to question 11, just like in the company questions, we added issuance of after the word denied. So you would need to respond if a bonded company has ever denied issuance of a bond for you. Question 12 and 13, as in the company question, is where the individual question, do you have any unsatisfied judgments or liens against you, has now been split into two questions. And as I stated during the company questions, both lien and unsatisfied are newly defined terms in the glossary. And finally, question 14, the final financial disclosure question. Are you delinquent on any court-ordered child support payments? Has not been changed. So let's turn to the regulatory action disclosure questions, part 1. So, excuse me, one moment here. Let me get one. So just like in the company questions, the regulatory action disclosure questions have been divided into two parts. Once again, part 1 will be applicable to all applicants, and part 2, which we'll get to shortly, may or may not be. So in question A, or in question 15, we added a local regulatory agency, a governmental entity, and any consumer protection authority to the question, mirroring the same change in the regulatory action disclosure questions for companies. As mentioned in the company questions, and as I stated there, consumer protection and governmental entity will be newly defined terms. Item C was reworded to read license or authorization to conduct. And we also added the word another before financial services business to make it clear that this reference is to another licensee. Also, the term order was revised to clarify that it includes an order stipulated to by an individual. You could find the redlined proposed definition of order in the materials as well. And item F was reworded to provide clarity. So on the next slide, you will see the remaining items for question 15, G, H, and I. There have been no changes to items G and H. And item I was reworded to account for how a regulatory action may be brought. As we said before, it could be either pursuant to an administrative action or a civil action. And we also added dismissal of an action pursuant to a settlement agreement as an item that must be disclosed. So turning to the next slide, questions 16 and 17, we'll do 16 first. These two questions, 16 and 17, are once again an example of a current question, which is question N, that's been broken into two based on findings and actions. So question N today asks about pending civil actions for those items that appear in question 15. Once again, we have findings and actions. So question 16 has the findings that are found in question 15, and question 17 on the next slide have those actions that are in question 15. So both of these questions, once again, were reworded to account for how a regulatory action may be brought. As you can see the parenthetical, a pending regulatory action, either administrative or civil. So the language in questions 16 and 17, broken down between findings and action, mirrors and tracks the language in question 17. So let's move on to the part 2 of the regulatory action disclosure questions on the next slide. Once again, these may or may not be applicable to an individual, and if they're not applicable, you can indicate so by saying not applicable. These questions follow the same construct for the similar company questions. The language was cleaned up a little bit. So let's turn to the specifics just to refresh. Question 18, we expanded the type of contractor to include local contractors. We once again changed the contractor language to read act as a contractor on behalf of a federal, state, or local government entity. And we also, where we changed that language in the intro paragraph that gives some guidance on these questions. We also added restricted and debarred to the actions being inquired about, and we just generally cleaned up the language so that they read a little easier. So question 19 is the second part of question N, and we added a local contractor here. Questions 20 and 21 are new, and they are the same construct as questions 18 and 19. These inquire about one's financial services or professional licenses, and these questions were added because the answers could be germane to an individual's character. So moving on to the next slide with our termination disclosure questions. There's no substantive change to this question. We've merely cleaned up the language so it reads a little better. And then turning on to the next slide, as you'll see, we now have, as Cindy Fazio told us at the beginning, we have isolated all the questions that pertain to your actions while you're exercising control activities. So currently today, all the questions pertaining to control activities are embedded in the individual sections. So now we've isolated them in their own section. So I think it makes, as you're completing the questions, it's easier because the first set of questions all pertain to you individually. Then you get to the second set, which are going to all pertain to while you had exercise control. So turning to the next slide, once again, if you don't or you've never exercised control over an organization, these questions would be not applicable and you would be able to indicate that they are not applicable. So questions 23A and 24A, as seen on the screen, replace question J3 in the individual disclosure questions currently. Question J3 asks about pending civil actions for those items that appear in question 1. One of the items is a finding and the other an action, specifically an injunction. So once again, we've broken this one question J3 that we currently have into two questions. Question 23 has the finding item that is in question 1, and question 24 has the injunction item. Item B was added to both questions 23 and 24, and item B was added to capture prior findings and injunctions in these two questions. So let's move on to our next slide, our criminal disclosure questions pertaining to control activities. In this particular question, once again, we made the change to any court. In items B and D, we added the word any before pending to modify the term charges. And in item C, we added in the past 10 years to mirror the new limitation to the misdemeanor inquiry. Turning to the next slide on financial disclosure and control activities. In item A, we added whether voluntarily or involuntary to describe the bankruptcy petition. And in item B, we added issuance of after the word denied to track the language that I've mentioned before with the company questions. So turning to the next slide, regulatory action disclosure questions for control. questions 27 and then 28, which you'll see on the next slide, replace questions M and O in the current individual disclosure questions. And they talk about the first regulatory action disclosure question for individuals, which is number 15. And you probably know what I'm going to say. Question 15 has findings and actions. So once again, we've broken those up into 2 questions. Question 17 or 27 asks about the findings that are listed in question 15 pertaining to how you exercise control over an organization. And turning to the next slide, question 28 asks about those actions that are listed in question 15. Actually, item 28, item A asks about the action that is in 15. The current question O asks about pending civil actions for some of those items listed in 15. So items B and C on the next slide cover the pending actions. So these questions also mirror the change to the individual regulatory action disclosure questions. Turning to the next slide, these are for questions for individuals that exercise control or organization that currently holds or has ever held a financial services professional license or has ever been authorized to act as a contractor. Once again, if these are not applicable, you will be able to state not applicable. And once again, we talked about before that organizations can be law firms or accounting firms, and it's the individuals within the firms that hold the licenses, not the organizations. So these 2 questions have been amended to only inquire about the organization's financial services professional license or its ability to act as a contractor on behalf of a federal, state, or local government entity. Consistent with the prior revisions, we added a local regulatory agency, governmental entity, and any consumer protection authority to the question. And question 29 addresses actions previously taken against the organization, while question 30 inquires about pending regulatory actions. So now I believe we have a couple polls, and then I think we probably have quite a few questions in the chat. So let's move to the next slide for our, I think we got another poll.
So Janine, while we get the polls going, I just wanted to let you know we've been marking the questions to discuss during the Q&A session. You were rolling through pretty good, and we didn't want to interrupt you. So we have several questions lined up for that portion.
Okay. So our first question is, do you agree with pulling out the control activity questions from the various sections and placing them after the individual questions? It looks like a couple people aren't real sure. Maybe it's because you threw a lot at you, but it looks like the vast majority of respondents think that this is a good idea. And please, we want your feedback, which is why we really did a deep dive, so you could really hopefully understand the changes. I know there's a lot; it's a lot to cover, but hopefully, when you go back and look at the proposal, we provided a detailed analysis as well that you can read through. So I think we have one more poll question. We can go to the next one. Just a general question like we had for the control of the company questions. Do you agree with the revisions? And once again, those of you that I don't know, certainly understandable, especially if you haven't had a chance to take a deep dive on the proposal. But hopefully, as you read through the proposal, which provides significant detail, you'll agree, hopefully. Okay, so Lisa, I guess we have some questions. I'll do my best to answer.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for what you've just provided to us. We're going to move on to our question and answer session now. Please put your questions in the chat. We're going to do our best to get to everyone's questions. If we don't, they'll be collected and responded to later. But we're going to start with the questions that we've already marked, and then we'll jump back into the chat and pull the fresh ones from there. So Janine, these first two are in regards to the company disclosure questions. Can you explain what was used to create question 13 again in regards to material litigation? And here I think they're just asking about the model
Sure.
law.
Yeah. So the Money Transmission Modernization Act, which is what we refer to as the model law, is a product of a joint industry and regulator working group. And the model law is something that I think both industry and regulators are favor. And in the model law, one of the requirements was that a company, as part of the application process for money transmission, disclose whether they've had any material litigation. So we have to accommodate the model law in our disclosure questions. So we added the material litigation question to the disclosure questions. And you may say, well, why did you, it only applies to money transmitters. Well, when we looked at it, the material litigation question is really germane to all industries. So it was added for all industries.
Thank you, Janine. So there was some confusion around the questions about prior criminal or other violations that said ever, whereas other places were limited to 10 years. I believe the question, yeah, I think it's where the misdemeanor changed from ever to 10 years.
Right. So this is a big change, right? Currently, the misdemeanor question requires you to disclose if you've ever had any misdemeanors. We've now limited that so that you need only disclose if there has been a misdemeanor, if you've been found guilty of a misdemeanor within the last 10 years. Currently, companies only have to disclose 10, so we mirrored it on the individuals to 10.
Exactly. And I just to kind of back up what our questioner or our chatter said, yeah, because more than 10 years ago, these things are not particularly relevant. So this is another
Correct.
reason why we moved to that.
Well, and
Okay.
also it was pointed out, misdemeanor could be something that you did when you were young and perhaps felt very silly and don't need to disclose. They're really not germane. So we decided to limit it to 10 years.
Okay, so will there be a glossary or definition section included on NMLS so that the individuals would know the intent of the question, since some might be misinterpreted?
Sure. So there currently is a glossary in the guidebook that all these will be added to. I'm not sure if your question is asking whether there will be actually a glossary, so you could click on a term as you go through the disclosure questions and come up with the definition. We haven't talked about that yet, but that's possible. But as there is today, there is a glossary in the guidebook that would have all the definitions that we've suggested today, and as well as the revisions that we're proposing.
Okay. So here's an easy one for you. On what date will the new disclosure questions be released?
That we don't know.
There you go.
So, but I will tell you that, as you know, we're in the middle, about halfway through a little over halfway through our public comment period. Public comments are due August 22nd. Once we get those comments, we will review all of them. It's a pretty, I'd say, a tedious process. We'll look at those that take into consideration, those changes that we've identified that we believe we should make based on those will be presented to the Lawyers Committee. The Lawyers Committee will make their recommendation, and then once they make their recommendation, they will go to the Policy Committee. Once the Policy Committee approves them, I believe that I'm sure we will publish what the new disclosure questions are. When they will be implemented, we don't know. It all depends on the timing. Rest assured, they will not be implemented during fourth quarter when they're in the middle of renewal. We'll, certainly take into consideration what time during a license cycle or a year would be least intrusive for industry in answering those, as well as the regulators, because they're going to have to review them as well once you file.
So Janine, how long from being implemented do the individuals and companies have to go in to update their answers?
We haven't decided that yet. Certainly I can't opine as to what regulators will require. Certainly you will have had to have answered them before renewal season. Whether states will require that you answer them by a certain date, we don't know yet.
Is there a working session at Armor to review these updates and continue the review?
No.
Easy
I
answer.
will be at Armor, so if anyone has any questions, I'll be at Armor the whole week, and be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Yeah. And again, this is an opportunity for you guys to make sure you submit that feedback by August 22nd. By restriction, does that entail having to disclose financial status on a semi-annual basis for a finite amount of time?
Can you read the question again? I'm not sure I
Sure.
understand.
Yeah, it's a little confusing. By a restriction, does that entail having to disclose financial status on a semi-annual basis for a finite amount of time?
Okay, so the way I read this question, I'm not so sure I have an answer. That if your license was restricted to require filing of financials twice a year, would you have to answer that question affirmatively? And I honestly don't know.
So when sorry.
So on that, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah. So when questions change, it may change our responses or our loan officer's responses. Will NMLS align responses with the questions? And how much time will we or our employees have to update responses? Again, Janine's already answered this question, I believe, previously with, she's not 100% sure how, at this point, when that will be required or what time that will be needed to be completed by.
But you'll have
Yeah.
a good amount of time. This is not you have to do this in 2 weeks. You will certainly have time, plenty of warning.
Plenty of warning, plus it's already coming, so plenty of time to get prepared. Is there an option to add a link to find regulatory actions or administrative actions? I'm assuming this is on the question form.
Is there an option to add what?
To add a link to find
regulatory
actions or administrative actions.
A link defining that? Is that what the question was, Lisa?
To find them.
Oh, a link to find them.
Yeah.
Well, I assume that if you've had a regulatory action against you, though, that you would know that you have one. So I'm not sure what the link how that would help. But if you've got something in particular in mind, please put it in your comments and we will certainly, take a look.
So here we have another question. Will this take effect at the release of NMLS 2.0? And again, this is not, it's not required for the modernization process. It can happen or occur at any period of time. It's not reliant on modernization. Will these new disclosure questions, we already answered that one. We're getting a lot of renewal questions. There's a lot of concern around renewals.
We won't do them during fourth quarter and renewals, rest assured.
We promise. Does the new definition of key individual include branch managers or qualified individuals included on the NMLS records?
No, branch managers and QIs are totally different and are not deemed part of key individuals. They're separate.
Okay. Is there any explanatory information such as the reasons for adding material litigations as it relates to money services and the Modernization Act? So we users have a better understanding of the whys.
For that, I don't know. This was, as I said, this one particular requirement came out of the Joint Regulator and Industry Working Group in developing the model law. So, but I can imagine, material litigation really goes to the very heart of an applicant's ability to conduct business. And, I think it was probably noticed that that's critical and rightfully so, not only to money transmitters but to any licensee.
Good point. Will the previous answers still be available in NMLS once the new questions are implemented? So I'm thinking, will they have a history to go back to look at to answer the new questions?
Yeah.
That we don't know
I don't
yet.
know. Don't know yet. Good question, but we don't know.
Okay, just rolling through the questions that popped up to make sure we're not answering duplicates.
I see one, would insurance claims be
Yeah.
included in regulatory actions? I don't think an insurance claim is a regulatory action. Do you agree with me, Lisa?
I agree. And just an FYI, that was the last question. So if anyone has more
Okay.
questions, feel free to add them into the chat. Should there be a legal question regarding your record being sealed?
Well, we did denote that if you have a sealed record in state law or relevant court order doesn't require you to disclose it, you don't have to. That commentary was added to the guidebook in the disclosure question section that provides some general guidance for answering the disclosure questions. So I'm not sure what we mean by a legal question regarding them being sealed. If you want to add some more color to that question, we'd be happy to.
Absolutely. And again, make sure you add these questions and comments to the actual feedback that you provide us.
Yes.
So we're going to give it another
Please.
minute or two to see if we have any more questions come in, Janine. You can probably use break at this time anyway. I'm sure that was a lot to go through.
Thank you.
All right, well, while we wait for more questions, we're going to go ahead, and if you could move on to the next slide, please.
Sure. So thanks, Lisa. Go ahead.
All right, I want to thank Jim, Cindy, and Janine for their detailed presentation. I also want to take a second to also thank our production team helping us work out those technical issues at the beginning of our presentation. A reminder that comments are due back August 22nd. They should be submitted to comments@csbs.org. So if you've not already done so, please submit your company's feedback. Comments will be reviewed, and additional changes, if any, will be reviewed by the Lawyers Committee and then approved by the Policy Committee. Responses to the comments will be forthcoming, so be on the lookout for them. Next slide, please. You should receive an email with the meeting recording and slide deck by early next week. Please complete the survey for this meeting to let us know how we did. Check one more time, Janine, and see if we have any more questions. Again, if we missed any of your questions during the presentation or during the Q&A session, we are compiling the questions and we will make sure you get an answer. And if not, you can email myself or Janine. We can put our email address in the chat, but again, any comments, feedback, make sure you send them to comments@csbs.org. Not seeing any other questions. I want to thank you for attending our session today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week and the rest of your day.
I did see one last question. Can a definition for restriction be determined? Go ahead and if you respond, suggest that. Can't promise, but we can certainly consider it. I see Cindy shaking her head that, yeah, we could consider it.
Perfect.
So thank you very much for coming today. We appreciate your participation. Please complete the short survey. Let us know how we did, and please submit your comments prior to August 22nd. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.